Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. The American bombing of a Syrian Air Force base comes at a rather interesting point in time of American politics. First of all, let's take the steps that might have happened instead of this bombing. If in fact the Syrian government is responsible for these attacks, and we still don't know that they are, this has been asserted by the United States, but there's certainly been no independent investigation. If, in fact, it was, or it wasn't. If you are the president, one would think the next thing you do is, well, let's have an investigation. Let's go to the UN Security Council and demand an independent investigation to find out what party is responsible for this. Or if you, in fact, have intelligence, as they claim to have, that this was the Syrian government, then don't you go to the UN Security Council and present your evidence and get a Security Council resolution. And frankly, if you are afraid of a Russian veto, well, that's never stopped the U.S. in the past. And if the Americans came to a Security Council with such persuasive evidence and the Russians vetoed it, then there would be some moral argument on their side that they took some action. It wouldn't be so unilateral. That being said, none of that happened. In no time at all, a matter of hours actually, the Trump administration launched this bombing attack. And as I said, comes at a rather interesting moment in terms of American politics. Now, joining us to discuss this is Gerald Horne. Gerald is a historian and an author. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of many books. The most recent is Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary. Thanks very much for joining us again, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
So what do you make of this moment? Trump is under attack for being pro-Russian, and just a few days ago, he talks about overthrowing Assad is not the target, which must have royally, excuse the language, pissed off a whole lot of the American foreign policy establishment.
Well, I think you put your finger on a major issue, that this attack on Syria can be easily interpreted as a kind of wag the dog strategy by Mr. Trump. That is to say, the bloodhounds were on his trail as a result of his pre-November 2016 contacts with Moscow, supposedly helping him to defeat Hillary Rodham Clinton. And to show that he can stand up to Moscow, he launches this attack. It leads to Moscow basically saying that the hotline, which was designed to prevent the U.S. Air Force and the Russian Air Force from colliding over the skies of Syria, that hotline is now no longer operative. And you have a number of Democrats coming out and congratulating him for making this attack. Even Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, who's been a stickler with regard to the War Powers Resolution of the early 1970s, which mandates that presidents go to Congress before attacking a nation, he congratulated Mr. Trump on this attack, although he did say, like Nancy Pelosi, the congresswoman from San Francisco, that he should now come to Congress to get an authorization for military force. So in some ways, Trump has thrown the bloodhounds off his trail, at least temporarily.
We should add, that the vice president, if he's in on these conversations, Vice President Pence, when asked who would you model your vice presidency after, and he said Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney, of course, is the one that manufactured all the arguments for the invasion of Iraq. I don't know whether we're rising to that level or not in terms of lying and conspiracy. And I would not rule out Assad is responsible for all this. I think it's not without or outside of the bounds of what he's capable of, although it makes no political sense for him to do it at this time.
It makes no political sense. And keep in mind that after investigating the August 2013 supposed attack by al-Assad using chemical weapons, the independent journalist Seymour Hersh came to the conclusion that actually it was the rebels assisted by their Turkish allies. Keep in mind that both Damascus and Moscow have claimed that there were chemical weapon stocks that were hit accidentally by their aircraft, and that let loose the plumes and the clouds that helped to kill these individuals. That particular story has yet to be refuted authoritatively. Certainly you are correct to suggest that the international community should have done an investigation before there was any kind of resort to military action.
It's a rather sad comment on the state of the United Nations and the Security Council that there's not even a word of opposition outside of the Russians. I missed some of the earlier speeches. The only ones I saw was the Russians and the Syrians calling this an act of aggression. Excuse me. But all the other major powers, European powers, certainly applauded the American move. The Japanese applauded the American move. The Chinese were somewhat more reticent, but they certainly didn't condemn the American bombing. This means that we've come a long way from a Security Council that many of the members opposed the U.S. intervention in Iraq, and including France, stood up to the Americans and were not persuaded by Colin Powell's dog and pony show of weapons of mass destruction. Here, there's barely a pipsqueak of questioning whether the American intelligence is justified or not, or correct.
Well, if you look at France, you might be able to get an understanding of why Marine Le Pen, the right-wing candidate, is slated to do well in the upcoming elections, because President Hollande, the so-called socialist, applauded Mr. Trump's attack while Ms. Le Pen castigated that attack. I think it's also fair to point out that Bolivia, which is representing the Latin American left, denounced the U.S. attack. But all in all, it's quite unfortunate that there was not much more denunciation from the international community. But look at the U.S. domestic scene. Here you have MSNBC, which styles itself as the left amongst cable channels, but Rachel Maddow, who sees herself as some sort of leader of the left and the resistance to Trump, has had as a guest most recently Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the defrocked leader of NATO, a right-wing Danish politician. NATO, of course, is the anti-Moscow cabal. And what this reveals is that the Russiagate scandal, which should be investigating the pre-November 2016 contacts between Moscow and Trump, has bled into trying to whip up a new Cold War. Hence, Mr. Rasmussen appearing upon Rachel Maddow's show. This is part of the problem.
On CNN, if you want to talk about people being dredged up to be interviewed, James Woolsey recently, just I think yesterday, asking his view on what to do with Syria. He immediately turned it into a recommendation for Trump to launch a military attack on Iran nuclear facilities, even though there's zero evidence that there is, in fact, there was ever a nuclear weapons program, but the IAEA is saying Iran's living up to the nuclear agreement, and Woolsey says, attack Iran, and on your way back, take out Assad. And this relic, who's also an advisor to the Trump administration, although he headed the CIA under Clinton, he's dredged out on CNN. The war drums are beating.
Well, it's not only the war drums, it's the hypocrisy and the sanctimony. Here you have Mr. Trump, who got elected in no small measure because of his pledge to keep Syrian refugees outside the United States, now is shedding copious amounts of crocodile tears about Syrians being killed, supposedly, at the hands of Mr. al-Assad. Then you have Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, who's probably the biggest winner from this whole episode. He's probably been smoking celebratory cigars in his residence, because this attack on Syria marks a giant step forward towards a second attack, this time on Iran, which is clearly in the crosshairs. Likewise, I don't think it was coincidental, once again, that Mr. Trump was meeting with President Xi Jinping of China as this attack was unfolding, because North Korea is also slated for a regime change. There was an op-ed piece in today's New York Times prominently featured by a well-known academic calling for that precise remedy to be inflicted upon Pyongyang. I think that it's more than the war drums are beating. We're headed towards a catastrophe.
The role of MSNBC and the Democratic Party leadership in a narrow political game, you would say, they should have actually accused Trump of trying to save his rear and raise the issue of international law. It would have been better in terms of their partisan attacks on Trump, not to give him this thing of attack that looks like a victory, a political victory. Yet they do. The leadership of the Democratic Party, and you're absolutely right to include people like Rachel Maddow in the media, they actually seem more committed to this kind of war hawk stance towards Russia and Iran than they are than even wounding Trump.
Well, it's quite curious that in today's New York Times, which was printed before the attack on Syria, Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton basically called for precisely what Trump executed, that is to say, a bloody attack on Syria. Interestingly enough, and it should be pointed out in all fairness, that Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts basically called for Congress to be involved in this scenario. And of course, there are other Democrats on the left-wing fringe who have called for international law to be invoked. But certainly you are largely correct to suggest that in some ways, Mr. Trump, who got elected on a platform of not getting involved in such escapades as the one he has just executed, now has taken the tack of the neocons and the liberal interventionists, which, by the way, goes against what he tweeted in August 2013, when the United States was once again on the verge of attacking Syria, when he counseled President Obama not to do what precisely he has just done.
Well, it's been said by several people that a president should not go to war with their own intelligence agencies. And clearly the American intelligence agencies want a ratcheting up of the tensions with Russia. Certainly the leadership of the Pentagon want a ratcheting up of the tensions. And in fact, there's an AP report comes out sometime on Friday where it actually says that the Pentagon is looking into the possibility that the Russians were directly involved in the chemical attack. It may be this didn't even come. When I say maybe, there's kind of two assumptions here. One assumption is that the Syrian government actually committed this attack, and the other is that it didn't, but the Americans want everyone to think it did. And if you follow the second assumption, it may not have even emanated from the Trump administration. He may be getting cornered himself by all these forces, both within the Republican Party, Democratic Party, and military industrial establishment, the intelligence agencies. He had a lot of people who didn't like this warming up with the Russians, and that's now kind of blown up, at least for a while.
Well, it's apparent that the wolves in the intelligence agencies were after Mr. Trump. And rather than succumb, he threw Syria off the dog sled. It's quite curious that once again in the New York Times, there's a front page story about the CIA claiming that they had evidence about contacts between Mr. Trump and Moscow well before November 2016. In fact, it's not only Mr. Trump in conflict with the intelligence agencies, it's apparent that there's also a conflict between the FBI and the CIA. Recall that before November 2016, Fox News was reporting that the New York office of the FBI was in virtual mutiny against James Comey because they wanted more red meat to be tossed to conservatives about Hillary Rodham Clinton's emails. And of course, Mr. Comey capitulated. On the other hand, it seems like the CIA was much more critical and much more hostile to Mr. Trump than the FBI. And that's why you have this front page story in the New York Times today.
So what does that tell us about the real bigger picture? And for example, you have a billionaire, a single guy named Robert Mercer and his daughter Rebecca, who are able to essentially, we've done this story on the Real News, essentially made Trump president. This hedge fund guy comes in. He's a high-speed quantitative trader of one of the most successful funds in the world, maybe the most. A company called Renaissance Technologies, picks up the Trump campaign after the convention, gives him Bannon, gives him Kellyanne Conway, and together they make Trump president. And then you have wars within the intelligence agency and the White House. You have factional fighting. The system itself seems in decay, and they don't seem very fit to rule.
Well, you hit the nail on the head, and it's very interesting that this is taking place against the backdrop of this mini summit between President Xi Jinping and Mr. Trump. Because if you look at elite analysts, they're pouring out a small library of books talking about the rise of China and the imminent decline of the United States. Of course, that particular tendency hit a zenith a few years ago when the British writer Martin Jacques published a book entitled provocatively, When China Rules the World. The Financial Times columnist Gideon Rachman has a new book out just this week called Easternization, which of course you should juxtapose to Westernization, which is about the rise of China and the decline of the United States. It seems that rather than confront that rather bitter and brutal reality, the elite in Washington would rather quarrel and squabble between and amongst themselves, and by the way, launch unwarranted attacks on nations like Syria.
Well, when you can't solve your domestic economic and political crises, the answer has always been war.
Well, that's the case, and unfortunately, we're not finished, I'm afraid. As noted, North Korea is certainly in the crosshairs. The problem there, of course, is that North Korea is rapidly developing the capability to have missiles that it can reach Hawaii, at least, if not the west coast of the United States of America. And likewise, I think that Washington may be underestimating the ability of Iran to organize and resist an attack that, if launched, could open the gates of hell.
Yeah, I guess the conclusion one can reach is if these people aren't fit to rule, and it seems to me it's rather clear they're not, people better get organized to do it themselves.
Well, hopefully that's on the way. I'm very heartened by the fact that the base, the popular masses, blocked the now successful appointment of Neil Gorsuch to the U.S. Supreme Court. I see a kind of stirring at the grassroots that hopefully will become stronger with every passing day.
All right, thanks for joining us, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.